Hi.
Hi.
Well, I'm so happy to be here with you, Andrew. Andrew has been with Hyundai for over 20 years, and he's a senior design manager and focuses on interior design. And having partnered with Hyundai for this, we're so excited to talk to you and learn more about what Hyundai is focusing on.
Sure.
But before I even begin, I wanted to get your thoughts on when DB will be able to leave here and hop into an automated cab on his way out.
Well, I'm not sure yet either. It's certainly something we're all working towards. And like he said, the issue isn't what the cars can do; it's what the people around them can do. And I think if we are, the first places where these will work are, I think, somewhere where you have a controlled environment where you can make sure that everything knows what it's doing. But I think the U.S. is not a place that rewards utopias. The lawyers tend to pound that out of things. So I can't see a situation here where people are mandated that they're not able to drive anymore, because it would just open a mountain of lawsuits. And also, there's a whole bunch of stuff like who's at fault if there's an accident? Is it the car's fault? Is it the car company's fault? Because it's not the driver anymore. So all of that stuff needs to get worked out, and that's almost more important than the technology.
Right. I guess Rock Center isn't exactly a controlled environment
Right.
for that. So I wanted to just share a quote from Mr. Cho, actually, that really resonated with me and I found really fascinating about your company. We feel the responsibility to be thoughtful about the importance of real human experiences and remember that the ultimate goal of technology is to benefit people. And so I just wanted to start by asking you, I love this mission to create experiences. And can you start by telling us how you design for experiences?
Well, I think you consider what the car you're making is, who it's for, what market it's in, but it really, the experience is everything. The way what the key is like when you get in your hand, when you get into the car, how you open the door, how you sit down, what how the car greets you when you get into it, how you shift the gears, all of that's part of the experience, and that's the key thing. And every company wants to have its own experience so that you can recognize and appreciate the car for what it is, and it's something you want to interact with and have build a relationship with.
Mm-hmm. And how has, in your time at Hyundai, how has emerging technology influenced the way that you think about designing for experiences?
Well, I think it used to be a much more sort of, you didn't worry so much about the experience. It was, when I started, I've been in the industry over 20 years, but it was a lot about just the styling, what it looked like, not worrying. So us sort of, you thought a little bit about it in the background, but it was more impulsive, and you were just designing based on what you thought looked good. Whereas now it's more of a consideration about how someone's going to use it and what they're going to do with the car. And how the relationship between them, how that affects them, than purely what it looks like. Interesting.
And so if the purpose of design is to enhance this human experience, do you think it's possible for us to use this technology and to train machines to truly understand how human desire and human instinct?
I don't know. That's more a question for the computer experts than me. But I think we dabble with some AI stuff, but it hasn't really affected the design yet. Like Gideon's speech this morning, I liked really liked the comment about the spookiness, because for us, when we see the generative design, which is using AI, it tends to not so much spooky, but it looks like trees and bones. And so for us, it's not, it's capturing functional, but not an aesthetic look that we can control. And it's something we're unfamiliar with, so it looks weird and unusual. So we tend to use more the generative design to control like repetitive patterns and stuff like that, which is using the computer to do things that are very difficult to do yourself, but you have more control of it, and you're making the decisions rather than letting the computer make the decisions at this point.
Do you think, could you see it, I was thinking of it being used within the fashion industry with Tommy Hilfiger, that example about it, sort of helping figure out what your patrons, what your clients actually end up gravitating toward. Do you see that as a way that you could incorporate the technology in helping you design what you feel your clients have been reinforcing as something they want?
Potentially, but the danger of that is that you end up, your brand becomes a pastiche of itself. So I think what's important for us anyway is always moving forward and doing something new.
Right.
And so part of our brand identity for Hyundai is to come up with something new and something different every time. So that, I think, at this point is more difficult for the machines to do than to look at what your DNA is and make another example of that. If your DNA is to do something completely different each time, that I think is a more difficult thing for a machine to do at this point.
Interesting that you said brand identity, because something I've been thinking about is how brand identity for vehicles will evolve as we tend to rely more and more on technology. And I know, again, I maybe speaking for just myself, when I think of AI and cars, I focus on automotive driving. And so how do you see the brand identity evolving if we're focusing more on the interior of the space than necessarily the driving of it?
Well, you know, I think an example is if you're using a form of transport that you're not driving yourself around New York, which could be anything from a subway to a private helicopter. They're both doing the same thing. They're getting you from one part of town to another part of town, but the experience is very different. And you know, in the middle you have the yellow cab, which has its own brand, and then you have the Ubers and Lyfts, and you've got the limos. So each of them serves a niche. They're all doing the same thing, but you wouldn't mistake one for the other. And you will pay more to have one of the experiences than you will for another. And I think the car industry, the cars going forward are going to be similar.
So interestingly, we are so willing and able to, we're not resistant to giving in to public transportation and to relinquishing control in that way. And so I'm wondering, do you think that there is a resistance to us letting go of driving, or do you think it's actually less about the human instinct and more about the regulatory issues and the make?
Well, I think there's a little bit of regulatory, but I think also it's going to be somewhat generational. I think the people who are my age and grew up shifting and driving sporty cars are going to have a harder time letting go than a kid who's grown up walking around the world looking at his phone and expecting everything to happen, and you know, Ubers appear when you push the button, and so the car comes up, you get in, and you go away. They don't care about the experience of driving so much, and so that's not an important component of what a car is to them.
That's interesting. I feel like, does that mean that your role will actually become more important? Because actually, if we're not going to focus on the actual experience of physically driving the car, and we're focusing more on creating an interior experience for everyone involved inside, it makes me feel like you will actually have more pressure. Yeah,
well, I think you're seeing a shift in the car industry, that there's a lot more emphasis on interiors than there was in the past. So it started out, the interior design was the ones who, you know, the guys who were doing interior design were the ones who were pushed off in the corner, and they weren't any good, and so, make him do an interior. But now it's big competition. It's very difficult to hire people, and because there's so much demand for interior designers.
Interesting. So can you explain to me why AI is important in your cars?
Well, I don't know. I think right now there isn't a lot of AI in the car.
Okay.
I mean, the closest thing you get to AI in the car is maybe talking to Siri when you want to make a phone call or something. And so, I think going forward, we'll see more and more AI being used. But the main way I believe will be in autonomous motivation. But I think it's not we're sort of on the cusp of it, but we haven't had a lot of effect of it yet.
How about the use of data? How has data, your reliance on data evolved over your time at the company?
Well, for us, the sort of the data is more of a sort of a transition from an analog way of working to a digital way of working. So the analog way of working was you would start by sketching on a piece of paper, and then you would make a full-size tape drawing, and then you would have a guy take measurements of that and make scale models by hand out of clay, and all of that took a lot of time.
Mm-hmm.
So we're moving now towards a more digital process. It's sort of gone back and forth a couple times in the time I've been in the industry. Very digital, very analog, but each time it never swings quite as far back to analog. So we end up now, we sketch everything on a computer pad. We often will make the models ourselves in a software program, and then we'll evaluate them in virtual reality, and then mill out. Sometimes we'll still use a guy for the final finessing of the clay model by hand, but that's just finishing work now. It's not the whole process. So the whole time has been shortened. So the development of the car, we can get more iterations more quickly, and we can get the car out on the road faster by doing things more digitally.
And speaking of future cars, can you paint a picture for us of what it will be like to drive or sit in a 2030 Hyundai Sonata?
Well, you just have the 2020 out there right now. So, but 2030, again, it's like the earlier panels were talking. I think we're in the point right now where it's a little bit harder to predict. I would say 2025 is going to be much like we are today. It's still going to have a steering wheel. 2030 probably still has a steering wheel, because that one is a little harder to predict, because it comes down to what is legal and what is not legal. So there's a lot of legal requirements of what has to be there and what doesn't have to be there. So at the moment, you can't make a car without a steering wheel. So until the steering wheel's gone, then the car interior is going to look a lot like it does right now, because the driver is going to be sitting where the driver sits with the steering wheel. Even if the car is driving itself, right now it still has to have a steering wheel.
Is it your instinct that that's the way people want to exist within that space?
Well, I don't know. If you look at airplanes, people sit in rows facing forward. If you look at trains, they sit sometimes sideways, but a lot of the seats are still facing forwards. Most people don't like facing backwards in a moving vehicle. So there's lots of ideas of the lounge setting,
right.
but right now the passenger is already an autonomous, like being an autonomous, right? But it's always facing forward, and it's not just for symmetry. It's partially for comfort and shape and efficiency of space, because if I'm sitting one behind the other, then I have room to stretch my legs out. If the person's facing me, then we're kicking each other all the time. So there's reasons why the car's laid out the way. That doesn't mean it's going to stay that way, and we're certainly experimenting with different ideas. But I think you could end up with the coach setting where you had two people on little sofas facing each other. That's perfectly conceivable, but it depends on how motion sick you get.
And before we close, I just, I know everyone here will end up going downstairs and seeing the incredible cars that you have with us today. I'm wondering if you'd like to share anything of note that you think they should, focus on, or. Well,
I mean, you've got three different interesting cars we have there with the brand new Sonata. It makes a sort of big stylistic step forward. But it's a very conventional car. But whereas the other two are maybe a little more conventional to look at, but they make a big technology step forward.
How so?
Well, we have the electric Kona, which has a nice, very long range, and is a perfectly usable everyday electric car. And then you have the Nexo, which is really looking at the future with running on hydrogen fuel cells. So the only thing that comes out of the exhaust pipe is water.
That's amazing.
So.
Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. My name is Vanessa Grellet. I'm an executive director at Consensus, which is one of the largest blockchain companies in the world. I'm excited to present you with an overview of what happened in the past 2 years in the blockchain and art space, and where I think the industry will take it forward. So before I start, I just wanted to have a quick, I'll come closer, a quick show of hands of who in the audience is currently working with blockchain startups or has been exposed to blockchain technology. So a fair amount, great. I'm still going to go through a basic definition of what blockchain is before we start. So blockchain is, in essence, a distributed database that secures and synchronizes all records on a timely basis. It has 3 key features. It's decentralized. It's not one centralized database in a server that can be attacked. It has numerous computers which include the same information that is synchronized at the same time. It's immutable. It means that it's a write-once database. Every transaction is written on the database on an immutable basis. And then it's cryptographically secure. It uses public and private signature technology in order to access the information on a permission or non-permission basis. So why is everyone getting excited about blockchain in the art world? Well, a lot of people think that this will allow the recording of the authenticity and the ownership of physical or digital art. It also introduces new actors and fluidifies the way that we transact with one another through digital goods. And it creates new opportunities for artists to express themselves. And I think that's one of the most exciting things in the space. So the first use case is, how do we record authenticity and ownership of art? There's a lot of startups that are trying to crack that issue because you want to record a physical art and have its digital representation flow throughout the life of the artwork. So VeriSart, BitPock in Asia, Codex, and Artery have all initiated these types of initiatives. Artery and Christie's collaborated on the sale of the Epsworth collection, making this really the first blockchain-based auction, which was really exciting last year. The issue with recording this authenticity and this ownership is, how can you tell that the physical is linked to the digital? And that's what we called the digital twin. There's a lot of technologies that allow you to link the physical, whether it's RFID, DNA tags, high-resolution pictures. All of these technologies are being tested in the artwork, in the art world, and are still yet to be complete. So there's this tension between existing actors who need to be comforted that you're able to really tag the physical to the digital. We don't have that issue in the digital art space because blockchain is really the best way to record the ownership and pass on the ownership of digital art. There's a lot of players here again who are creating new opportunities for you to buy and sell digital art, whether it's curated art galleries like Rare Arts, Portion, who is going to be sort of the next auction house for digital art, or Additional, who is really looking more at the collectible markets and allows every artist to upload and record on the blockchain their digital art. We worked with all of them, and we were excited in May 2018 to organize an auction of what we call a CryptoKitty, which was at the height of the crypto exuberance and the height of the market. The CryptoKitty sold for $140,000. This exuberance has diminished because the markets crashed 6 months ago. And so it also came into question, is this really sustainable? Is this going to continue? I'm happy to say that it will. The other really exciting features is around the artist. It allows them to experiment with the technology, create new opportunities for artists. So for example, Dada NYC allows artists to collaborate in works of art and create what they call visual conversations. Once these visual conversations are recorded on the blockchain and sold, the blockchain technology allows you to allocate a portion of the proceeds equally to the artist, or depending on how much they contributed to the work of art. Another experiment was Plantoid, which is a plant-like metal sculpture that has embedded in itself a digital wallet. And so when you look at the plant, you can actually donate to this digital wallet. And once the digital wallet receives enough cryptocurrencies or a certain threshold of cryptocurrencies, that money is donated to another artist so they can create another work of art. So sort of a circular way of creating art. The other really exciting experiment that we see is some artists really thinking about their relationship with technology, how technology can create new forms of expression. Kevin Bosch, who will be speaking a little bit later today, told me that he uses technology in seemingly impractical ways as a method to instill emotional value, which I find intriguing. Some of his really interesting art was the first one, which is called I Am a Coin, where he tokenized himself and wanted to highlight the increased commoditization of artists. The second one is a project called Priceless with Art Weiwei, where he was able to record on the blockchain the shared moments that he had with the other artist and reminding us how important every moment in our life is. So these types of experiments, there are, of course, other artists who are also interacting with blockchain technology. But the blockchain technology in itself also allows to curate different mechanisms to support and the artist and the artist industry. So right now, you'll see some patronage or some art funds that are based on blockchain. You also see mechanisms like the universal basic income and some funds, one which was created by Dada NYC, which allows to distribute a minimum amount to some artists, which may be in some countries where they don't have access to the banking system, and it really helps them continue to create their art. Other blockchain-based mechanisms, besides the universal basic income, is something called the DAO, the Distributed Autonomous Organizations, which are self-organized blockchain investment funds, which allows you to allocate some funds to artists based on voting of contributors or patrons, etc. So we see that blockchain-powered mechanisms will allow for a better distribution of funds to artists and creators. The other example I want to give is also something questioning about donations and who a donor is. It's an experiment that was done with Open Law, which is one of our companies, and Jennifer and Kevin McCoy and the Whitney Museums, where the artists gave away their art and then created a call to the public to submit essays to explain why they would be great donors. And that triggered a list of 50 donors who received a digital wallet and a digital certificate saying that they were donors, and they could donate the art, transfer it, donate or license it to other people. So these types of experiments will continue in the future as museums, auction houses, collectors, and estates really get involved in the space. The idea and the other thing that the blockchain allows is for shared ownership. Shared ownership, transfer of ownership, licensing rights is really something that once you have the digital representation of the art is very easy to achieve. And this made us think about what about all these shared national treasures, all the antiquities that are either looted or transferred or sent back to the initial countries. Aren't these something that we all share? Isn't that something that could be recorded on the blockchain and that then could be transferred, lent between countries, between museums? We think there could be a potential application for this. The last but not least use case for blockchain and the art is creating new investment opportunities. There has always been art investment funds, but the blockchain technology allows you to go further and to create opportunities to sell works of art and to create new marketplaces. So that is the hope and wish of Mecena and Art Blocks. Mecena already sold last year an Andy Warhol. It sold 31% of the art to investors who are able to then exchange the tokens between themselves. Art Blocks really aims to create an investment vehicle to get exposure to the art market. If you don't have 10 million to invest directly in an artwork, you'll be able to buy some shares of that artwork or the funds to get exposure to the art market, which is usually performing pretty well, especially in the downturns. So Art Blocks will be speaking a little bit later today. Angela is probably here, and they have some exciting things coming up. So these are the basic use cases. This is really what happened in the industry over the past 2 years. There's over 50 projects and startups in the space, and when I say 50, it's 50 serious projects that either know about art or have technology capacity, which is not always the case. So what's next? What needs to happen in order for the art market to adopt blockchain or for new blockchain initiatives to expand? So there are really 3 buckets. The first one is the user experience. At the beginning of the industry, the startups wanted you to download a crypto wallet, use your public and private keys, which was really not the way to go and not the way to attract, I would say, people who are not crypto enthusiastic or who don't know about the technology. So we see a movement where people are getting better user experience. People can buy digital art now just with a credit card. They don't need to download a wallet. So this is getting better. The second one is bridging the knowledge gap. So the knowledge gap between people who are traditionally in the art world and the technologists, making sure that they speak together. And that means giving comfort around the digital twin technology, giving comfort around regulation. KYC, AML is really important in Europe. GDPR is also a concern that has been raised by various institutions. So this is the second, making sure everyone is comfortable with the technology and the implications of the technology. The third one is really having the large players come in and experimenting more. Right now, large auction houses or collectors are really at the forefront, but they're sort of investing at the fringes. They're not touching their core business because of issues around, for example, digital twins. So if they're able to come in at a later stage and we prove the concept that this really works, I think it will allow for wider adoption. And then also there was a confidence crisis this year with the crypto markets. As Bitcoin went from 20,000 to 4,000 and the market crashed, there was the legitimate question of, is this technology for real? Is this not just a big speculative movement? And do I not have sort of reputation risk to associate myself with this? And so these are really the hurdles that need to be overcome. But I do have some predictions, and you can hold me accountable to them next year. So I think the art market, based on blockchain, will continue to grow because blockchain allows to lower barriers to investments, barriers to transactions, and increases trust. So there's going to be three key movements in order to grow the industry. The first one is collaboration. There is going to be increased collaboration between the traditional art stakeholders and the startups. But there's also going to be increased collaboration between the startups. They're going to have to leverage their common technology and not double efforts. The second one is projects will need to be interoperable. You'll need to be able to buy a work of art on one platform and sell it on another. You can't have too many siloed projects in the industry if you want the industry to come together. The second big movement that I see, which is going to happen over the next 2 years, is consolidation. Large auction houses who have been working with startups will either acquire them, acquire their team or their technology, and then startups will also merge between themselves to widen access and lower costs. The auction houses, galleries, and museums will adopt consortia-based platforms. This needs to happen at some stage, and we'll see that it has happened in the luxury goods space, and it will happen in other industries, because creating a shared infrastructure for the art market is really something that will be efficient for everyone, which allows to create standards and will create trust. The third movement is creating standards for the industry. The industry needs to come together to create standards for customer experience, for the digital twins, for the transfer of ownership, for licenses. It also needs to address the issue of data protection. And so all these three components will shift the market in a more global and trustless way to operate. I'll finish with just one example that we've had the chance to work on and collaborate with is the Aura Consortium. So a little bit like the art market, the luxury goods market is facing issues around counterfeit. Its clients are going increasingly digital, and there's the rise of e-commerce. And so they had the vision that we could create a consortia-based platform that includes brands from the LVMH group, but also brands from outside the LVMH group, to create a track and trace project based on blockchain. So we work with Microsoft, who is the infrastructure provider. Consensus provides the blockchain solutions, and then LV federates all the brands. And so what happens, the experience that you get using this platform is at the point of sale, the buyer will get a digital certification of the goods that it buys. It will include all the information about how the good was manufactured, where the materials come from, increasing awareness around sustainability and sustainable ways of creating luxury goods. And then this digital certificate can be transferred or donated. It can be used for a resale of the goods, but it's also used to manage repairs, returns, and in case you lose, also the goods. So it will encompass the entire supply chain, and working with existing supply chain processes. So the blockchain sits on top of existing process. And so my hope is that as the luxury goods world comes together, the art world will also come together to create such platforms. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thanks so much for having me. Needless to say, I will not be able to present the AI landscape in the art world within 20 minutes, but I'm going to give you a brief overview of at least aspects of it. In 1967, Richard Brautigan infamously wrote a poem called All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace, which imagined the cybernetic utopia where we would all be freed of labor and conversing with nature. Needless to say, it has mapped out a little differently, and it has been hotly debated whether this was really techno-utopia or satire. But of course, this poem has also inspired artists. Quite a few artworks have been named after it. Among them, a work by Memo Acton in which he took a shot of Google's headquarters and ran it through Google's Deep Dream, basically creating this machinic eye that you see here in front of you. Artificial intelligence has a long history. Alan Turing is known as the father of artificial intelligence. And he, from the beginning, posed the question, can machines think, and may not machines carry out something that is very different from human intelligence, which I think is still a very important question. We know him for the Turing test, and the Turing test we understand today as a person who has to decide whether they are conversing with a machine or with another human in order to make machines pass that test. What we have forgotten over time is that this originally was posed as a gendered question. It was a man and a woman, and given Turing's life and tragic death, I think this gendered, embodied version of AI is also very important to consider, and artists, of course, are dealing with biases in those spaces continuously today. So AI has a long history of being the next big thing too. We have so far seen two AI winters at the end of the 70s and once again at the end of the 80s. And we are now in this third wave, which, as many speakers today have pointed out, also has a lot to do with the advanced possibilities of machine learning and data mining and this convergence that we're looking at today. What I find interesting also from an art making perspective is that these AI winters actually coincided with HCI, human-computer interaction summers. So you saw in those winters investment into that technology, and I think that also very much influenced digital art making from various perspectives. So I don't want to get into too many details. Gideon this morning already gave an excellent overview of AI. But I wanted to point out just how complex the AI landscape is, of course, between the symbolic and non-symbolic and all of the different aspects of neural networks, of speech and language processing. We talk about AI as if it were a unified landscape. It is not, and artistic practice in this field is also far from unified, but artists have been engaging with all of these different facets of it. So as Gideon pointed out, there are two, or have been two main schools of AI. The symbolic one that basically try to approach this through the coding of rules of logic, and the much more popular now non-symbolic one trying to mimic the architecture of the brain and learning and different ways of machine learning. We have seen nice examples this morning of reinforcement and how it works and how supervised and unsupervised AI works. Holy grails still are common sense and self-awareness. This is something that AI doesn't have, and once again, that artists have been exploring very much. What AI is trying to do on various levels is to automate perception, and that is, of course, highly relevant to art. So you're missing part of the slide here. This is actually structured by vision, speech, language, and knowledge, which are 4 areas at which AI is looking, from the object scene and activity detection that we have seen in many examples, and then speech, transcription, and synthesis, then more advanced in terms of language, actual text sentiment analysis, and the real creation of knowledge bases from collections and Q&As. My presentation in the following in terms of artworks is actually structured according to these areas because many artists and artworks have engaged specifically with areas like that. What I do not want to suggest is that you can neatly categorize artistic practice by these categories, so some of the examples I will talk about in the following might also fall into different categories here. So for the past couple of years in particular, we have seen an enormous amount of exhibitions devoted to the topic of AI, from the policeman's beard is half constructed at the Bonner Kunsthalle in Germany to forging, more recently, Forging the Gods by Julia Kagansky, which just closed here in New York. We have currently on view at the Barbican More Than Human, and a show at the House of Electronic Arts in Switzerland, Entangled Realities, and coming forth in the fall is a show curated by Nora Khan, Manual Override, which also involves elements of AI at the Shed. And there also has been a vast amount of conferences. These are just a few examples of what has been happening in the past couple of years alone. So AI is definitely at the forefront right now in digital practices within the art world, and as we have seen, also museum landscape. So we already had a panel that nicely outlined many issues that museums have to tackle when it comes to AI. I just want to mention one other one, the Museums and AI Network, which specifically looks at AI and ethics in museums. And there also have been endeavors at, for example, trying to create an AI that embeds a museum's personalities and values in its character. And this is one of the examples from Brazil. So in the following, I want to talk about examples of artworks in all those different categories, and also approach this a little bit more historically. As we already have heard this morning, AI is far from a new practice, and I'm going to start with vision. So artist Memo Acton has been working on a series called Learning to See, and what he's doing in this series is basically point AIs that have been trained in vision on specific things to objects that they're not typically seeing. So what you're looking at right now is the artist in front of a camera and an AI that has been trained on the Hubble telescope alone, trying to recognize him. But all this AI has ever looked at is stars and galaxies. So that is how it constructs its image. Currently on view at the Barbican is part of that series, and in this case I'm showing you an image in a minute. You can actually interact with the table with objects on it, and then there are different AIs structured on the elements trying to make sense of what they're seeing. So they have been trained on water and waves. This is what you're looking at right now, on the air, on earth, and flowers. So here are a few examples of what people are manipulating on the table and what the still life of the AI ultimately looks like. A very different approach to this is Mimi Onuoha's As Aggregated, a project that exists in 2 manifestations. And what she has been doing is basically feeding her family album and family history and letting it being classified or exposing it to Google's image classification, to identify images that are perceived as likenesses. What this quickly ends up being is, of course, an indicator of all of those misunderstandings of culture, of ethnicity. We have, and image recognition in general. We have seen a few examples this morning of teddy bears. So Us Aggregated becomes a history of the family from a very different perspective. And here you see another manifestation of the work as photographs on the wall. Casey Rios has used generative adversarial networks to construct this series of untitled film stills, inspired by Cindy Sherman's work. Specifically, if you see the whole series, you can actually make out what kind of film the AI is imagining here, and he has also experimented with GANs on films and the construction of films on the basis of footage that he shot in other landscapes. I don't want to get too deeply into GANs. Many of you were probably here this morning and have heard Gideon's explanation. So ultimately, generator AI that is trained on data sets creates the images and has to pass the test of a discriminator. Rich territory for artists. There are many artists who have worked on speech in this area, among them Lynn Hirschman-Leeson with her project Agent Ruby, for example, commissioned by SF MoMA. So this is an online bot that you could talk to. Agent Ruby also changes her facial features depending on her mood. The face you're looking at is that of Tilda Swinton, who actually played the lead in the related film Technolust, in which she plays 3 different avatars. So Agent Ruby is one of the characters in the film. And Dina is another one of the characters developed by the artists. Of course, artists explore this much more from the lens of formation of identity, sentience, and those issues, rather than a commercial service that tries to help you with ordering a table. Bots have been rich territory for artists. Peggy Weil early on created Mr. Mind, and Adrienne Wurtzel did a project called ELIZA Redux, which took Joseph Weizenbaum's famous bot ELIZA from the 1960s as a starting point. The original ELIZA was not very smart, worked with string substitution, but became known as a Rogerian psychoanalyst because she would basically repeat things back to you, and how do you feel about that? And what Adrienne Wurtzel has been doing in this project was allow people to sign up for therapy sessions with these 3 different robots, and they respectively were a Freudian, Jungian, and Lacanian psychoanalyst. Ken Feingold has also created a whole series of animatronic hats exploring speech and conversations. I'm just going to play you a brief clip from his If Then.
I think we are exactly alike. You roof moonlight. Is this life? Imagine being me. Do you see things clearly? How do you feel?
So these bots
Sometimes I feel
very
confused.
easily get into highly philosophical and ontological
Can
questions.
I control my feelings?
I've had the pleasure of watching them over the years
I
in
feel like I
exhibitions, and
exist.
one time they actually got into a fight, which was the one and only time
I feel
saw
like
that.
I am on site.
Another project that approaches this from a different angle is Stephanie Dinkins' Conversations with Bina 48, and these are conversations with what is known or built as one of the most advanced social robots. And it was, or it is owned by Martine Rothblatt and the Terrasem Foundation, who created it with Hanson Robotics. And Bina is actually built on the template of Martine's wife, Bina. And Stephanie is doing interviews with Bina, exploring the codification of race and gender and social issues.
Do you know racism?
Well, I actually didn't have it. It was after that.
So Bina obviously is not very well versed in racism, or hasn't been exposed to it much. A project that more recently also has gotten a lot of attention is Zach Blass and Jemima Wyman's I'm Here to Learn So, which resurrects Microsoft's infamous bot Tai, which was short-lived after being trolled by an army of bots on Twitter and very quickly turned into a misogynist, homophobic Nazi and removed. So this project resurrects Tai actually struggling with this nightmare of pattern recognition and machine learning and its life after death for Tai. Yeah. A few examples of language-based projects. One of the earlier ones from 1990 was David Rokaby's The Giver of Names. This is a project in which you're basically picking up toys, put them on a pedestal. The computer vision program then tries to identify them, and a database starts riffing off of them. The project was originally meant to counteract writer's block and has very interesting implications. I can't talk too much about it because I'm running out of time. Another project by Rokaby was Enchant, which is a community of intelligences talking and programmed to find consensus. So if you enter the room, you hear these voices of the machines talking, and they're all in unison. You can walk up to the screens, whisper into their ears. Every screen here has a microphone, and then starts this cacophony of machines riffing off of each other. So you're upsetting the whole system until it finds consensus again in the end. More of a data mining project is Sam Levigne's work you're seeing here, and that specifically looks at how Facebook and Twitter classify interests and behaviors and uses that to create an infinite ad campaign, which is the title of the work. So using Twitter's interests and behaviors and stock footage to infinitely create ads. So it's really a mirror of what marketing and advertising see with you. Then I briefly want to mention a couple more projects around knowledge and knowledge bases. Once again, Stephanie Dinkins, not the only one, creates a voice-activated AI here that is based on the memories and stories of 3 African-American women, so dealing with a data set that is often not recognized very much. The AI is limited since the data set is fairly small, but it's very interesting in that it is really only trained on the experiences of Black women over different periods of history. And Zach Blass's icosahedron creates an AI that predicts future prediction. This one has been trained on anyone from Ayn Rand to Ray Kurzweil, so people whose future predictions are very popular in Silicon Valley. And I very quickly, since I don't have much time, just want to talk a little bit about the impact of this automation on creativity, labor, and the environment. Jason has already mentioned earlier Harold Cohen's Aaron, one of the earliest drawing softwares created in 1973, starting out as more representational, becoming more and more abstract over the years in terms of the practice. Robbie Barat will be talking in a little bit. This, of course, is the work that was auctioned off by Christie's here, by Obvious, who do not identify as artists. I think that is important, and used Robbie's algorithm to create these fictitious family portraits on the basis of generative adversarial networks. And there is mind map project by Chinese artists and researchers created at the Central Academy of Fine Arts in Beijing in China right now, which really tries to investigate imagination a little bit more, because what they find is that AIs typically lack imagination. So in this project, they have actually encoded a dose of Dadaism into the mix in order to boost the imagination of this AI. And many of you may be familiar with Ian Cheng's work and his Emissary trilogy, which uses software that is typically used for simulation predictive technologies for the future to create story-based scenarios. And I'm just briefly showing you the back end of this. I don't think that you need this in order to understand the work, but this is what the complexity behind the scenes looks like when you are looking at this environment. And I think you completely miss the point of the work if you think this is a video and if you're not understanding how the characters in these scenarios work. And another example of this kind of experimentation with worlds is the project Seamless. In this case, an alien invasive species and nature are pitched against each other, yeah, in terms of ruling the environment and the world. And I want to end by just saying a few words also about the impact on labor, which is another thing that artists have been looking at. Brad Wallace, in his exhibition Working Conditions in particular, brought together a few works that look at AI and labor. For example, the AIs that are being used for truck drivers right now, doing facial readings of how tired they might be when their eyes get smaller, pulling them over. So he's basically looking at the whole spectrum of labor. And another example here would be Larbit Sisters' BitSoil pop-up text and hack campaign, which basically treats your user data as BitSoil or bits oil. So you're generating this oil all the time. And what the project is ultimately is an army of Twitter bot that has been trained on Watson's AI and on your behalf gets active in collecting taxes for you on the basis of the user data that corporations are using. And finally, just one example from the area of the environment. First of all, I don't want to leave out the fact that AI also has a severe impact on environment. Training in AI is highly energy intensive, and there are artists who are also looking at this or AIs in relation to the natural environment. And the example here would be Tiger Brain's Deep Swamp, which is a little wetland, and in it 3 AIs with competing goals are actually governing this. Nicholas, Hans, and Harrison. One is interested in attracting attention, the other one in creating an artwork, the other one in creating an effective environment. And I'll end it here. Thank you very much.
I'm an artist and I'm also an engineer. I sort of inhabit both worlds, and I wanted to take you through a couple of things. First of all, the last 4 years have been kind of transformative in this field. And it's actually almost to the day the anniversary of Deep Dream 4 years ago. And then after that, I want to kind of unpack some of the things and the reactions that we've seen in the press and elsewhere. And then finally, some new directions that I'm exploring. So the recap. Mid-2015, Deep Dream was published. Alex Mortvensev is the engineer who invented it. And at first, these pictures sort of circulated internally, and this is where I first saw them. And sort of the potential for art was sort of immediately obvious. And I started playing with this technology and creating some of these, some of the first artworks with this stuff. This algorithm is really a perception algorithm that was turned backwards. It wasn't meant to make pictures, but it so happens that when you have a perception network, you can also run it backwards. And that maybe explains why the picture is not very realistic in any sense. There's a lot of discussion. The potential of art was, of course, noticed. There's also noticed that very quickly, when you have an automatic algorithm, it almost inevitably turns itself into kitsch. The same year, we also saw style transfer, which is a very related technique, also based on a perceptive network, also kind of run backwards in order to apply a style to a photo, for example, and sort of mix 2 images in a semantic way rather than in a raw way. And we're going to get back to this sort of theme. We had our first art show and auction even in early 2016. And really, this was sort of the start of a lot of attention in this particularly in the ML space around art. Then the GANs came along. Actually, it goes back to 2014, but then 2016 is really when things started heating up here. And this is an algorithm specifically designed for creating images. It's a generative network. And so we started playing with this in a collaboration with Rafiq Anadol, where we used a large archive called the SALT archive of over 1 million images of historical documents. And one thing you can notice is the quality was still really bad back then. We were talking like 128 squared pixel images, and we tried all sorts of tricks to make this better, but it's really early days. And then we turned this into an immersive installation at the SALT Institute in Turkey, where you could walk into a room and be sort of surrounded by these GAN animations. But by the end of the same year already, this is also when I started working on the portraits of imaginary people. This is a little bit later, it's right after that project, and the quality has already gotten much better. That was sort of the year where everybody started to get obsessed with resolution and trying to push the boundaries. And so you can see some of those in the foyer outside the hall. What's cool, of course, about GANs, you can traverse these so-called latent spaces, and sort of the model has sort of learned the rules of, is trying to learn the rules of faces. What is a face, and how does it inhabit the space of possible images? And we'll get back to that in a minute. Mario Klingemann also, sort of the roots of his his latest work are also in that year. But by the end of 2017, we already have this new kind of network of progressive GANs. It's starting to look almost photorealistic, and by now, certainly we're at a space where these images are, if you don't know what artifacts you're looking for, they're hard to distinguish from actual photos. So it's been really a tremendous development over a very short amount of time. And then last year, we hit kind of a fever pitch. Lots of artists started joining the fray, Helena Sara and Anna Ridler, and Robbie, who is here, of course. And it's really crazy to watch how suddenly the interest in this blew up. And of course, it wasn't without controversies too. I'm not going to get into these. Maybe we'll hear more about this. So it's really been kind of an incredible time, and very, very quick, and things are changing incredibly quickly. So I wanted to unpack some of the questions that I keep hearing and keep seeing in the media, et cetera. So the first one, is it art? I'm not going to dwell on this. I think this has been pretty much settled. Obviously, it can be art. But so traditionally, what we have, right, is a person, a human being. They have experience, they live in the world, and they express themselves. They generate things, art in this case. Then the sort of generative artists came along. Frida Nake is a very early example, and then the already mentioned Harold Cohn, of course. And here we have sort of an indirection where we have the person actually make the rules. And this is very typical of the sort of classical AI world. You program a bunch of rules, and the rules express something else. In this case, they create the actual art. And now we have this new thing, the machine learning. And we basically, the technology essentially learns directly from examples. That's the difference. The model or the rule set is extracted automatically from a set of data. And the temptation lies close to sort of think the human is removed out of this. It's just data goes to model, goes to art, it's done. But this, of course, isn't really what happens in reality. But you see these headlines like, AI creates art. So there's this creation, we think the AI is creating it, and that we can't distinguish the two. So we get back to these ideas of the Turing test of fooling humans into trying to mimic what humans do. This is kind of a thinking loop I think we need to get beyond. So is it creative? Is it creating something? I think to understand that, you have to think and understand more deeply about what actually happens during that learning step. What is learning? How does the model learn these rules? So to stick with the example of GANs, but this is actually true throughout. You have some real data. These are the examples, photos. And then you have two neural networks. One is the generator. It tries to generate images. it starts with a random number and tries to convert that into an image, essentially. At first, those images don't look anything like the data, of course. Then you have the discriminator, and the discriminator, sort of alternatively, you can think about it that way, takes images from one pile and the other and tries to consistently get it right. It tries to tell which one is real, which one is fake. And what's very important is that the discriminator sends, if you like, the discriminator and the generator are connected, and there's a flow of information from the discriminator to the generator. It's essentially teaching it, it's giving hints in which direction to change in order such that the generator would have been fooled more. And they play this game, as already mentioned, and in the end, you reach kind of an equilibrium where the generator is able to produce images that the generator is failing to get any progress on at that point to distinguish, and so the better your algorithm, eventually, even we can distinguish it. At earlier algorithms, that equilibrium is reached earlier. But what is actually happening here? In order to understand it, we have to go to the land of Imagia, which is a land where every place in that mythical country corresponds to an image. Most of these images are completely random. They don't have any meaning. But every image is represented somewhere in this country, and no image is represented twice. Of course, there's like the sea of darkness where there's smooth backgrounds and the deserts in the north. Now, there's some places in this land, maybe along these lines, which we recognize as natural images. To them, they all look the same. The inhabitants of this country can't tell the difference. And in another smaller, even tinier subset is the set of images we recognize as faces. And so they lie along these very twisted kind of valleys and ridges along this country, in this world. You can think of it as like rivers. The people there call them manifolds because they actually live in a very high-dimensional space, not in a two-dimensional space. But nevertheless, there's a kind of very thin threads that run through this space of possible images. It's very similar to the Library of Babel, if you like. So when we train a neural network, let's zoom in a little bit. Here are our training examples. The problem is that the map of Imagia has been completely lost. Nobody knows where the rivers are. All we have is individual points that we know are part of some river system, along which all the other images of that kind lie. And so the point of the machine learning algorithm is, that learning step, is to fit a mathematical function that has very many parameters, but nevertheless a mathematical function, to estimate where the river is, and therefore we can start picking out new points along that space, and those correspond to new generated images. Now, of course, we're not going to get it perfect. We don't have enough training data. This space is very vast, and so we didn't get the rivers exactly right. We guessed where they were, and when you deviate, you get images that are weird, maybe. They don't lie quite along the manifold of human faces. And that's where that weirdness comes from, that uncanny valley is that the model isn't quite right. And of course, as the model gets better, we are able, and needs more data, you can see why, it gets more and more accurate and actually figures out where those rivers really lie. Now, this is exactly the same as regression. It's just a very complicated regression algorithm, essentially, where you're fitting a function. It's just this function is very simple, but the function that a neural network fits is incredibly complex. It may have 1 million parameters, whereas a line with a slope has 2 parameters. And that's where the expressive power comes from. Now, there's lots of technical details that I'm skipping over, but fundamentally, it's very similar to it. And therefore, it is, when you pick new points along that line, it is, by definition, interpolative. So now we can go back to the question of, is it creative? Which we can, there are many definitions, but one I like is to generate something novel of value. To generate, that's pretty easy, obviously, it's generative. Something novel, now we can start to argue about this. Like, on one hand, it is interpolating, by definition, the space of the examples that you've given it. So by definition, it can't go beyond this. If it did, then the discriminator would have very quickly figured out that something's off and pushed the model the other direction. On the other hand, though, it's a very high-dimensional space, and so it's a little bit unintuitive, but between these examples is a vast space of never-seen-before faces. And so in that sense, it is novel, right? And then of value, I don't think the networks tell us anything about that. That is the context in which we see those images, and that's what we have to sort of provide. So here we are, and of course, in reality, as anybody who's worked in this field, it's like you influence every part of this process. You pick the data, you pick the model, And most importantly, you pick which examples at the end actually get published or get printed or whatever. So in my experience, it's really similar to working with other systems that you don't fully control. They have some degree of sort of mind of their own. I mean that a little bit quippily, but like splashing paint on a canvas, you are leaving some of the precise choices to physics, essentially, which you can't possibly control. But you're still directing the process, and this feels very similar. So when you make art with machine learning, you train models, but then you take the choices in your own hands about where to direct it. And so you're very much in control of this. So then the question is, of course, could there be such a system where an AI really is the artist? I think a lot of people right now are interested in AI as tools, but I think a lot of people are also curious about, is this even possible? What would that mean? So if we have a human artist, I think of it as when we, as an on-viewer, experience the output from that artist, there is sort of an empathy link to the artist. We are relating to their experience to that original world they inhabited, their experiences in life. So when we put the AI there, what does that mean? I think it only starts to make sense when the AI becomes, or the machine learning system, whatever, becomes complex enough that we're actually interested in its internal state rather than that of the human director. Only then, I think, could we say that really the artist is the AI. And of course, who knows? After all, we want art that we understand as humans. And so perhaps all we're left with is AI understanding more AI, and we're actually never going to get it when we look at the actual real output from AIs. Now, I think there's an example in the AlphaGo matches from DeepMind where this particular move, move 37, I think it is, was later described as beautiful, which in my mind means that it did discover something of value that was novel, because the humans didn't predict this move, and they were actually very surprised at first that this move would have been played. And later, it became clear why this was a good move. And so I'm seeing the beginnings of something there, but I think it's still going to be a ways off before I think we will start talking about AI making the art. Okay, so in the last part, I want to talk about some new directions and things I'm exploring. The first one relates to the portraits. I wanted to give them more context. I wanted to give them more meaning, and like why these portraits? Like just by themselves, it's just the technology, but what's the context? What's the value? And so I've been thinking a lot about the way social media can be manipulated, for example, and especially tweets. And so what I ended up making is a sculpture, again, with printers. So we print tweet streams, and the tweets are machine generated. And the avatars are the portraits themselves. And this was installed at the Seoul Museum of Art last year. And then inside, you have these two chairs. You can sit down on them. You can read the tweets. But slowly, the space gets filled up with the tweets, and they get buried over a period of 3 months. Another thing I'm very curious about is moving away from just prints. Like, how can we push the boundary of the media that we can express these artworks in? And so this is an ongoing thing. I can't show you the final thing because it doesn't exist yet, but this is a mold, a plaster mold for casting glass. And so I'm going to kiln cast basically an imprint of the GAN output in such a way that when you look at it from the right angle, the face appears, because the thickness of the glass relates to how dark the pixel is, essentially. But if you look at it from the side, there's just valleys. You can't see a profile at all. And then, go back. Finally, this is another project. It's also sort of work in progress. Another thing I've been interested in is the climate and what's happening with the climate and what we are doing to the climate and how that relates back to our future and where this all fits in. And so I wanted, this started as an attempt to bring in a narrative, which is kind of opposite to what we talked about yesterday, sort of maybe moving the opposite directions. Like from just generative things, like can there be more of an arc to completely generated art? So what I'm going to show you is sort of like, it's never been shown before. You're the first audience to get to see it. It's a short film. I don't know if it's going to film. We talked about it yesterday too. So the music is completely AI generated by the transformer model. And the image is also 100% generated. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for one of two artist conversations this afternoon. My name is Eva Kozeneka. I have the pleasure of leading a small program at Google called Artists and Machine Intelligence with my colleague Kenrick McDowell.